You know, down here at Goat House Farm in sunny Florida, breakfast can be, well, it can be a real goat rodeo sometimes. Seriously, picture it. All these hungry goats just pushing, shoving, try to get the best spot at the feed bunk. It's chaos, hopeful bleats, some strategic headbutts. And if you got your own herd, I bet you know exactly what I'm talking about. Every morning, it just makes you wonder, right, why are some of them so pushy, so dominant? And then you got others who just seem to struggle to get a bite, always getting pushed aside. Welcome to Hoof Notes, where we make goat science make sense. Today, we're diving deep into that very question. We're tackling this age-old mystery for goat owners, trying to figure out why some goats are just, well, more aggressive at feeding time, why others struggle, and how it all links back to their individual personalities, and even something as basic as how high their feeder is. Our guide for this journey is a really fascinating scientific study. It's from Small Ruminant Research. The paper's called Personality of Dairy Goats Affects Competitive Feeding Behavior at Different Feeder Heights. And yeah, this research specifically looked at how those unique personalities that we see in our animals actually play out when food's involved.
Exactly. And our mission today really is to break down the key findings from this research for you, the goat owner. We want to unpack the science, give you some insights that hopefully can help you understand your own herd's dynamics a bit better. Recognize the different ways your goats cope with that mealtime competition, and maybe, just maybe, make your own breakfast routine a little less chaotic. It's about bringing this research right into your barn.
Okay, so let's start there. That chaotic scene at the feeder.
Yeah.
What did this study actually find about why it gets so competitive?
Yeah, good question. The source is really clear on this. For dairy goats, the feed bunk isn't just, a casual place to eat. It's a place of intense competition. The researchers saw all the behaviors you'd expect: physical pushing, frontal clashes, chasing, lots of headbutting. And these kinds of aggressive or agonistic behaviors, they're especially common when space is limited, which makes sense, right?
Right. So it's not just a couple of troublemakers. It's kind of built into their behavior, especially when things are tight. But what really jumped out at me was that idea that not every goat reacts the same way. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. That's one of the really striking things here. The study highlights this significant individual variability. Even when facing the exact same competitive situation, goats just don't respond identically. For instance, they mention older research. Get this. When feeder space was cut back, 30% of the goats reduced their feeding time by over 40%. That's huge.
Wow, 40%.
Yeah. But even more dramatic, some individuals saw their feeding time drop by 80%.
80%. That's barely eating.
Exactly. So this huge range really shows that each goat is an individual. And crucially, this research suggests that this difference, this variability, it's strongly linked to their underlying personality traits.
Okay, that's the really interesting part for me. How on earth did they figure out goat personalities? I mean, it's not like you can give them a survey. Tell us about the goats they studied in the setup.
Yeah, the methodology is pretty clever. They worked with 13 Saanen crossed dairy goats. They were all non-lactating, nulliparous, meaning they hadn't had kids yet and not pregnant, about 13 months old. And importantly, they were a stable group, already had an established hierarchy, and they were housed indoors. That helps control for other things affecting behavior.
13 goats. Okay, so a small group, but stable.
Right. And to really ramp up the competition, they deliberately gave them very limited feeding space, just 13.5 centimeters of feed bunk per goat.
13.5 centimeters, that's tiny.
It really is. To give you some perspective, the recommended sort of best practice in New Zealand for milking goats is more like 40 centimeters per goat.
40. So this was way less.
Way less. Imagine your whole herd trying to squeeze into a space where they can barely stand side by side. That was the situation. Highly competitive.
Okay, wow. And they changed the feeder height too, right? How did that work?
Yes, exactly. They systematically tested 3 different feeder heights. First, there was the floor level feeder, so the goat's head is down low, kind of like grazing.
Okay, natural position.
Then the head level feeder, where the goat's head is pretty much level with its body.
Makes sense.
And third, an elevated level feeder. For this one, the goat actually had to put its front hooves up on a step, so its head and body were angled upwards to get the food. This let them see if that posture changed things.
Huh. Okay, so intense competition, different feeding heights. How did they actually label these personalities? You said bold, fearful. How?
Well, it was kind of like a goat obstacle course for personality. They put each goat through a series of individual tests, things like exposing them to a new environment, seeing how they reacted, or putting a strange object in their pen. They also had a sudden startling sound. They actually opened an umbrella right near them.
An umbrella?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Seriously. And they even tested their reaction to seeing a dog. Based on how the goats behaved across all these tests, did they explore? Did they freeze? Did they run? Did they go back to eating quickly? The researchers identified 4 consistent personality traits. They called them bold, fearful, exploratory, and active escape. It's basically finding patterns in how each goat consistently reacts to new or stressful stuff.
That is just fascinating.
Oh.
A goat, Myers-Briggs. Okay, so what happened when these different personalities met at that crowded feed bunk? How did being bold or fearful actually change their behavior at mealtime?
Right. This is where it gets really practical for us goat owners. Let's start with the bold goats. In the tests, these were the ones who were quick to return to the food bucket after a sudden stimulus. It's like the umbrella pops open, they startle, but then they're right back to eating.
Okay, the resilient ones.
Pretty much. And at the feed bunk, they were definitely assertive. They initiated more aggressive interactions, especially at that floor-level feeder. And they also tended to start more agonistic stuff, like butting or chasing, behind that floor-level feeder too. And here's a key thing for you. They were displaced less often. They held their ground no matter the feeder height.
So they didn't get pushed away easily.
Exactly. And because of that, they had greater feeding times overall. Interestingly, this increase in feeding time was even more noticeable at the head level and elevated feeders. And their waiting time to get to the feeder, generally it decreased. They weren't waiting around.
Okay, so your bold goats are the go-getters.
Mm-hmm.
They're proactive, maybe even a bit aggressive, and they make sure they get fed to kind of create their own success, huh?
That's a good way to put it. They definitely seem to dominate the feeding situation. They aren't waiting politely. They're taking charge. Recognizing these guys in your herd is important because, well, they can set the tone and maybe stress out the others.
Right. Okay, so what about the other end of things? The fearful goats.
So, the fearful goats. In the tests, these were the ones who did not go back to the food after seeing the dog. It suggests more of a reactive coping style, less resilient to perceived threats.
Okay, more cautious.
Definitely. And at the feed bunk, this played out clearly. They initiated fewer aggressive or agonistic interactions, especially at that floor-level feeder.
Yeah.
They basically tried to avoid confrontation.
Makes sense.
And, critically for their welfare, they showed reduced feeding time across all feeder heights. The biggest drops in feeding time for them were actually at the elevated and head-level feeders.
Interesting. So maybe those felt more exposed or difficult for them.
Could be their waiting time. It tended to decrease a bit at the floor-level feeder. Maybe they snuck in when possible. But it didn't change at the elevated one. They just weren't getting as much time overall.
Gosh, you picture your own little timid goat, maybe Buttercup, just hanging back, nervous. It sounds like for these fearful goats, it's not just about getting less food, maybe, but the whole experience is just stressful.
That's a really vital point. Constant stress around feeding time that absolutely impacts their overall well-being. It can affect their immune system, maybe their growth or milk production. Even if they manage to grab enough calories later when things quiet down, they're likely compensating, eating later, picking up scraps, but it's definitely not ideal for them.
Okay, so we have bold and fearful. What about the exploratory ones?
Ah, yes, the exploratory goats. These were the curious ones in the personality tests. They scored high for interacting with new stuff, like climbing on things or touching novel objects.
The adventurers.
Kind of. And at feeding time, they were interesting. They were less involved in aggressive interactions at the floor-level feeder, a bit like the fearful ones in that respect.
Okay.
But their strategy was different. They actually spent less time feeding at that floor-level feeder. But, and this is cool, they spent more time feeding at the elevated level feeder.
Oh, so they avoided the scrum down low and went for the higher option.
It seems like it. Their waiting time also tended to decrease at the floor-level feeder. Maybe they assessed it and moved on quickly. Oh, and the study also mentioned that the fourth trait, active escape, wasn't significantly linked to any specific feeding behaviors they measured.
Huh. So the exploratory goats were like the adapters. They don't necessarily fight, but they find a different way, maybe a less crowded spot, or one they find easier to use.
It really suggests that, a higher degree of behavioral flexibility. Instead of just confronting the competition head-on, they seem to look for alternatives, maybe less stressful options. They're kind of the problem solvers, finding the path of least resistance to get their meal. Smart strategy, really.
That is really neat. It shows there's more going on than just pushy versus timid.
Absolutely. And the study also gives us some clues about the feeder design itself, why height matters. The researchers suggest that the floor-level feeder might have been particularly tricky for the goats.
Why is that? Seems most natural.
Well, possibly because the structure, maybe a solid flame above it, could have blocked their backward view. Goats like to see around them, feel secure. If they can't see behind, it might increase anxiety and aggression.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Or it could just be the physical posture. Goats often have to splay their front legs out to eat off the ground. That might be uncomfortable, or it might physically limit how many can actually fit side by side. These are subtle things, right? Things we might not even think about when we set up feeders, but they clearly impact comfort and how the goats interact.
Wow. So, yeah, it's definitely not just about the goat's personality. It's also about where and how they're eating. It's that combination of the individual goat and their environment.
Exactly right. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, understanding these personality differences and how they interact with the feeding setup, well, that can be incredibly valuable for you as a goat owner. For instance, if you can identify your really bold goats, maybe you think about giving everyone more feeder space overall. Or perhaps even setting up separate feeding stations just to dial down the overall aggression in the bird. That could really help the less dominant ones.
Yeah, but, for someone with, say, 50 goats,
Yeah.
setting up individual feeders for everyone, that might be tough, resource-wise. Are there other, maybe simpler strategies that this research points to?
That's a very fair point. Individual stations aren't always practical. But the research does strongly suggest that simply increasing the total feeder space per goat can make a big difference. Even just ensuring there's enough room for them to stand comfortably next to each other without being jammed in, that alone can reduce competition.
Okay, so just more elbow room, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And for your more fearful goats, maybe think about providing quieter options, perhaps a feeder tucked in a less busy corner, or even adjusting when you feed them maybe slightly off peak times when the bold ones aren't quite so frantic. That could really boost their welfare and make sure they get enough food without all that stress. And as we discussed, just thinking about the feeder height itself is something relatively easy to change.
Right, those seem like manageable tweaks. And it's good to remember this was a pilot study, right? Only 13 goats in a specific indoor setup.
That's true. It's important context. It's early evidence. But it's compelling evidence nonetheless. It strongly suggests that these personality traits do explain a significant chunk of why we see such differences in feeding aggression and how long goats actually spend eating. And that knowledge is really fundamental for understanding how individual goats cope, and it gives us a starting point to make things better, even if it's just by observing our own herds with fresh eyes.
Okay, so let's recap this deep dive then. Goats, they definitely have unique personalities, no doubt about it. And these personalities really impact how they act around food. For some, breakfast is a power struggle. For others, it's genuinely stressful. And simple things like how high their feeder is can actually amplify these differences, potentially turning breakfast into chaos. Or, with a bit of understanding from studies like this, maybe into something a little more peaceful.
Exactly. So we really encourage you, the listener, take this back to your own farm, your own herd. Observe your goats. Think about those little quirks you already noticed. Are they bold, fearful, exploratory? And then consider, how might your current feeder setup or your management be tweaked just a little to better suit those individuals? Even small changes, based on understanding them better, can really make a difference to their well-being and, likely, their feed intake too.
Yeah, definitely food for thought.
Which kind of leads to a bigger question, doesn't it? If understanding personality makes this much difference at the feed bunk, what other parts of goat management could we improve by paying closer attention to these individual traits? Think about it. What other challenges or behaviors in your herd might personality help you understand and maybe even address, way beyond just mealtime?
That's a great question to ponder. The possibilities really open up when we start seeing them truly as individuals. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of goat behavior and personality. We really hope this knowledge helps you make sense of your own hoof notes back home and leads to happier, healthier goats for you and your family.